The first fundamental right granted by our Constitution is the right to equality through Articles 14 to 18. The second fundamental right is the right to freedom through Articles 19 to 22. We begin our study of the right to freedom with Article 19. Clause 1 of this article grants 6 rights to Indian citizens. Clause 1 of Article 19 declares that all citizens shall have the following rights, and then there are 6 rights. First, all citizens shall have the right to freedom of speech and expression. All citizens shall have the right to assemble peaceably and without arms. All citizens shall have the right to form associations, unions, or cooperatives. All citizens shall have the right to move freely throughout India. All citizens shall have the right to reside and settle in any part of India. All citizens shall have the right to practice any profession or to carry on any occupation, trade, or business. These 6 rights are granted by Clause 1 of Article 19. These rights are granted only to the citizens of India. However, these rights are not absolute. Restrictions can be imposed on the exercise of these rights. We will presently see as to who can impose restrictions on the exercise of these rights and to what extent and how. Before that, we will notice that the right to acquire, hold and dispose of property, which was earlier existing in the form of subclause F of Article 19 Clause 1, was deleted by the 44th Amendment of 1978. This right is now no longer available to Indian citizens. Now we come to the restrictions on the right which are granted by Article 19(1). First, restrictions on the right to freedom of speech. The clause which allows these restrictions is Clause 2 of Article 19. This clause says that a state can impose reasonable restrictions by law. We now know that who can impose restrictions? State. What type of restrictions can be imposed? Only reasonable restrictions. How the state can impose these restrictions? By making law. We also know that only the legislative wing of the state can make laws. And therefore, one thing is very clear from the opening line of 19.2 that only the legislature can impose reasonable restrictions on the right to freedom of speech and expression. Only the legislature can impose these restrictions. Next, we will see what are the grounds on which these restrictions can be imposed. Article 19 Clause 2 lists out 9 grounds on which legislature can make laws imposing restrictions. And what are these grounds? Sovereignty and integrity of India, security of state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, and contempt of court, defamation, incitement to offense. These are the 9 grounds on which restrictions can be imposed by law on the exercise of the right to freedom of speech and expression. Article 19(3) permits restrictions on the right to assemble peaceably and without arms. Once again, these restrictions can be imposed by the state by law. These restrictions also have to be reasonable, and these can be imposed on the grounds of sovereignty and integrity of India and public order. there are only two grounds on which reasonable restrictions can be imposed by the legislatures on this right or to assemble peaceably and without arms. Article 19 Clause 4 permits restrictions on the right to form associations, unions and cooperatives. State can impose reasonable restrictions by law on grounds of sovereignty and integrity of India, public order, morality. Here there are three grounds. Once again, the restrictions have to be reasonable. Once again, the restrictions can be imposed only by law. The executive wing cannot impose restrictions. It's only the legislature which can impose reasonable restrictions on the exercise of the right to form associations, etc. Similarly, Clause 5 of Article 19 permits restrictions on the right to move freely and to reside and settle in any part of India. Here there are two grounds: interests of general public and protection of the interests of scheduled tribes. These are the two grounds on which legislatures can impose restrictions. It may be the union legislature, it may be the state legislatures. And lastly, Article 19 Clause 6 permits restrictions on the right of profession, trade, occupation, etc. This clause declares that the state can impose reasonable restrictions by law in the interest of general public. Here there is only one ground: interest of general public. Restrictions have to be reasonable. Restrictions can be imposed only by law. Thereafter, it has been specifically provided in the second paragraph that state can by law specify professional or technical qualifications necessary for any profession or trade, and the state can also carry on any trade, businesses, etc. to the exclusion of citizens or otherwise. But for that, there has to be a law. The state can have monopoly of a trade. The state can exercise monopoly of any business if there is a law which authorizes the state to do so. The state can also specify professional or technical qualifications for any profession. It is under this provision that technical or professional qualifications have been specified for practicing law, for practicing medicine, etc. Next, we will see certain facets of the right to freedom of speech and expression. The first and the most important is the freedom of press. Do we have in India freedom of press? Does our constitution grant freedom of press? The answer to this question is to be found from the freedom given in Article 19 Clause 1. What is that freedom? The freedom of speech and expression. Freedom of press is linked to the freedom of speech and expression. We will now see what the Supreme Court has to say on the freedom of press in India. The court has declared that freedom of speech and expression includes freedom of press. So, freedom of press flows from the freedom of speech and expression granted by Article 19(1)(a). Liberty of the press has been treated as inseparable and essential for the right to freedom of speech and expression. So it is inseparable from this right, and it is also essential for the exercise of this right. Liberty of the press is very much a part and parcel of the right to freedom of speech and expression, and therefore it can be said on the authority of the Supreme Court declared in the Indian Express newspapers versus Union of India in 1984 that in India, for Indian citizens, the freedom of press is a fundamental right.